Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the 19th Wild and Scenic Film Festival. My name is Ashley Overhouse. I'm the River Policy Manager at the South Yuba River Citizens League, affectionately called CYRCL, or SYRCL. And I'm thrilled and honored to be here tonight for the live panel for River's End, California's latest water war. So I am pleased to do introductions for our esteemed panel this evening. Bettina Boxall is an award-winning journalist with the Los Angeles Times and our moderator this evening. Hopefully to join us later is Chief Caleen Sisk, who's the spiritual leader and tribal chief of the Winnemem Wintu Tribe, who practice their traditional cultural and ceremonies in their territory, also along the McCloud River watershed in Northern California. Dr. Jon Rosenfield is the senior scientist with San Francisco Baykeeper. Congressman Jared Huffman serves as the US representative for California's 2nd Congressional District and has since 2013. And then last but certainly not least, we have our talented film director, Jacob Morrison. So without further ado, I'll kick it off to you, Bettina.
Hello, so welcome all. So I hope those of you who are joining us have had a chance to watch River's End, which does a great job of looking at the complexities of California water and define simplistic explanations and solutions. It's not all about big bad Los Angeles or Westlands Water District or fish versus farms or urban versus rural. The bottom line is that when it comes to water, California, whether it's corporate ag or Delta farmers, or Los Angeles, or San Francisco, have basically been living by William Mulholland's credo. Here it is, take it. Everybody wants to keep on taking water from the Delta, whether it's upstream diverters or in the Delta or the exporters, and the result has been decades of stalemate. I probably wrote my first Delta story about 16 years ago. And over the years, I find myself just rewriting variations of the same story over and over again. Nothing much seems to change except the Delta environment, which keeps on deteriorating. We're stuck in a perpetual conflict. So Jon, tell me, how do we get unstuck?
Well, first, it's great to be here tonight, and congratulations to Jacob on the premiere of the film. I see we've started off with the easy questions, and I'm first up. In order to address this problem, we really have to see clearly what it is. The problem is that we're not using water sustainably. The evidence of that is declining fisheries, sinking groundwater surfaces, hazardous water quality in our Central Valley communities. And these indicators are just messengers. They're just telling us that we're not using water sustainably. The solution to the problem is, as you said, it's not going to be easy. What we need is political will. We have all the laws we need to address this problem. We have a state Endangered Species Act and a federal Endangered Species Act. We have a state Clean Water Act and a federal Clean Water Act. And my colleague here tonight on this panel helped pass a law called the Delta Reform Act, which requires that we reduce reliance on water taken from the Delta. So it's not that we don't have a law, it's like, let's pass a law. We've elected the right people, they passed laws. It's been over generations that we've done this. And yet somehow those laws don't get implemented. I mean, the first thing that Governor Newsom did on the night that he was elected was to put a hold on the State Water Resources Control Board's process of updating water quality standards. Those standards are now 12 years overdue, right? And they would do a lot to address this problem. So that's sort of we got to enforce the laws part. The other side of it though, because it's not just going to come from, enforcing laws and people being upset, is we need to bring some leadership needs to bring some creativity to this problem. It's been a thorny problem for California and throughout the West for decades. And we keep treating it like it's a zero-sum game. Like either Westlands is going to get water or the Delta Smelt is going to get water, or LA is going to get water, or the Chinook salmon fishery is going to get water. And in a zero-sum game, you're just going to be stuck in this tug of war forever. But there are ways out of it, which would be for the state and the federal government, perhaps, to come to the table with resources that help us transition out of this, so that they can say to these junior water contractors or contractors who get water from those who have junior water rights, we know you're going to lose some water, and we're going to help you transition to different ways of using water more sustainably. LA has been very successful at reducing its total water demand as the population has grown. Over decades, this has happened. In Westlands, as you well know, Bettina, there's 200,000 to 300,000 acres of land there that are actually marginal and generate toxins when you farm them. We should be to the point of repurposing that land to things that don't use a ton of water and actually support a local economy, because the agricultural economy of the San Joaquin Valley has supported the very wealthy and hasn't supported the communities that are doing all this work. This economy, the subsidized water-based agriculture, or it's all agriculture is water-based, but this subsidized water coming in to make lots of nut farms just hasn't worked for the people of that area. And it's up to state and federal leadership to bring resources to the table that can get us out of this tug of war over water.
Jared, that leaves us to you. And so, John was just talking about, all the selenium-laced land in Westlands. And of course, there was a proposal years ago by the Bureau of Reclamation to buy a lot of that land and fallow it. And it required congressional approval, and it would have been very expensive. It never got anywhere. And now, we're looking to a change of administration, and, so all you have to do is look at the past 20 years, and every time a new administration, comes in, things change. There's this sort of like this constant back and forth. During the George W. Bush administration, the endangered species regulations were weakened, the environmentalists sued. They were strengthened under the Obama administration. Then the Trump administration, weakened them, and lawsuits are pending on that. Now we're going to have another one. I mean, we just seem to be in this endless back and forth and merry-go-round. And so how do we, there have been proposals to buy out a lot of land and to retire land in the Westlands. They went nowhere. There have been stronger endangered species protections, and they get rolled back. How do we get off this merry-go-round?
Well, I don't have perfect clarity in answering that question, but it seems to me one way to get there is to take some of these things that they think they can do. You talked about go and take it. Some of these folks still think that there will be massive subsidies that materialize for their favorite water projects, that there will be massive new infrastructure, that they will just suck ever greater quantities of water out of rivers and estuaries, and that's how they'll get their next increments of water. That's how they will take care of their plans for the future. We've got to take some of that off the table because it's not going to work. We don't have the water left in the environment to allow that to happen. We don't have the money to build some of these fanciful dams and other projects for them. And I think if we do that, we can maybe have a reality check and an understanding that we're not saying you can't have water, but we're saying you got to find it in different places because the environment is tapped out, and we are going to have to start drawing some lines.
How do you think, Representative Huffman, things are going to change with the Biden administration? What do you see in terms of Western and California water policy?
Yeah, well, one thing kind of continuing on that thread, folks like Westlands will not run the Department of Interior, which they effectively do right now under the Trump administration. Just having a science-based integrity to the governing of these agencies is going to make a big difference.
Do you think that the biological opinions are going to be redone? And for those of you who are viewing, when you don't know what a biological opinion is, those are basically the way the endangered species protections in the Delta get enforced in terms of regulating diversions and how much water the environment needs.
I do think they'll have to be redone. I think that the politically corrupted biological opinions that rolled out under Secretary Bernhardt and the Trump administration are not going to stand. I think the incoming Biden administration is going to try to restore public confidence again in the honesty and scientific integrity of how we do the public's work. And so those that is, you know, a great place to start. Throwing those out, getting back to honest science instead of having political appointees rewriting what the scientists tried to say.
And how can you make that permanent rather than, you know, so let's say Biden lasts 4 years and we get a different administration in another 4 years, and then they start rewriting the Biden regulations, which is basically what's been happening for the past 20, 25 years.
Well, the pendulum does tend to swing. And I think some things are going to drive us to get out of this stuckness that you referred to in your first question. Climate change is going to be one of those things. At some point, we're going to need long-term plans that we actually are going to do, so that cities and other water users around the state are going to know where their water will come from as these cycles of drought continue to challenge us. There are tools and strategies that can meet their needs, and we can stretch these water supplies and make it all work. But if we just keep fighting this back and forth swing of the pendulum over endangered fish and, you know, squeezing that last drop out of the Delta, a place which, you know, as sea level rises, as levees fail, is a pretty lousy place to depend on for your future water supply if you really think about a climate change future. So I think we're going to be driven to some of these better solutions and answers by that, as well as the money, as well as if we can win some political victories and take some of these things off the table.
Jacob, so you got a real crash course in the complexities of California water. So my hat's off, because I know what it's like to delve into that. What was the most surprising thing that you discovered or realized or found out in the long making of this film and all your interviews?
It's a great question. I think big picture, the most surprising thing that I realized is that before I started this project, I didn't know where my water came from. And I think the majority of people in California don't know where their water comes from. They don't consider it. They don't sort of realize that our water use has an impact, you know, and then beyond that, they don't realize sort of the breakdown in terms of agriculture using 80% of the water in California. You know, the rest of the water that people use is, you know, just 20% of water in California. Things like agriculture using all of that water, but only making up 2% of the state's economy. These are sort of like big picture things that really helped orient the way that I told the story. And I think are things that everyone in California should know and should be taught in middle school, but somehow we don't know it. And I think, you know, to go back to your initial question of how do we get unstuck, I think until people sort of have a baseline understanding of water in California and the general populace cares, nothing will change, because people in agriculture care because it's their business. And people, you know, in the environmental, you know, working space care, people like the NRDC or people like Jon and Mr. Huffman. But this is a very small minority of people. And I think until people really care, there's not going to be the political will to get anything done.
What gave you, what motivated you originally to do this film?
Originally, I started just doing a short film on the drought, and this was in 2015 while I was still in film school. And it wasn't until I interviewed John Herrick, who is the attorney in the South Delta, who represents the South Delta's farmers and their needs. It wasn't until he really introduced me to the Delta, you know, explained to me that this one area of water 2/3 of Californians get water from the Delta, and yet most Californians have never heard of it. And sort of, how 6 species of fish in the Delta are going extinct because of unsustainable water diversions. I think once I was talking to him, I realized that there was a really interesting, very engaging story, but it would have to be a feature film. And so I had to really reorient from this short film to the feature film. And so that's why here we are 5 years later talking about it.
What's the most depressing thing that you came away with after all these interviews?
I remember talking to Larry Collins, who's a salmon fisherman in the San Francisco Bay. And actually, when I interviewed him, I think it was either the first or second time, because I came back to him a few times. As I was walking into the pier, I noticed that there was a ship that was sinking into the bay. And I asked Larry, why is this salmon ship, submerged, and what's going on here? And he explained to me that one of his friends who he had been fishing with for a long time had actually, drank himself really to the bottom of the bay, got really drunk and sunk his ship because he was so depressed that he was unable to catch any more salmon because there just weren't enough. I think sort of realizing the numbers of, there used to be something like 1,500 salmon boats in San Francisco Bay. Now there's something like 300. Sort of realizing the amount of people who've lost their livelihood in this story was very depressing.
I see some questions are starting to pop up. We will get to those in just a little bit. So thank you. Keep the questions coming. Hello, Caleen. So years ago, I've interviewed all of you for stories. Interviewed you for a story about the proposal to enlarge Shasta Dam, and you talked to me about how the original construction of Shasta in the 1940s, and for those of you who don't know, Shasta Dam and Shasta Reservoir, it's the biggest reservoir in the entire state of California. It's on the upper Sacramento River, and is critical to the water supplies that San Joaquin agriculture gets, that's conveyed through the Delta. And you were telling me about how the construction affected your tribe. Could you repeat that? What happened to tribal lands with the construction and the flooding of the Sacramento River around there?
If you look at the setting at the time, we're in the 1930s, which is the Great Depression for America. But on the river, we don't really know it's the Great Depression because there are plenty of fish, and it's a land of abundance, and it's always been that land of abundance. But then, in looking at the World War II coming on at the same time, they began to build this great dam to, one, provide jobs for people who were out of work, and that it would be this keystone to the empire of California. And at the same time, there was no rights for the Indian people. It was barely we were citizens as of 1924, but my grandma and those guys, they didn't know how to read English or write English, and there was no really reason for them to do that. So the pushback on that was very little. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, at the time it was called the Indian Service, supposedly to take care of the interests of the tribe. But in that taking care of the interests of the tribe, they actually got the land away from the tribe. The 1941 Act was passed. It's one of the ground laying acts of Congress that allowed the Shasta Dam to be filled. But nowadays, they don't even list that act when they're talking about the water act.
Very, very briefly, what did that act do?
That act took our land and promised to give us like land. It promised to move our cemeteries and an infrastructure so that we could start over. None of that happened, except for they took our land and filled the dam up. Now they're going to do that again. You know,
Well,
but
I think they're going to have a bit of a problem with that, but
yeah,
yes,
well,
they're trying to do it again. Yes.
yeah. But at that time, you know, there was no attorneys and there was no laws to protect Indigenous people's rights, you know, and now I'm hoping that there is some laws that can be utilized to help correct this. Not only stop the Shasta Dam from being built higher, but it can correct the injustice that took place that allowed Westlands and everybody else to get rich off of the water that made us homeless, put us into poverty, which we didn't really understand what that was. That's not just about not having money, that's being no access to your livelihood.
And so in terms of tribal water rights, I mean, there was a decision years ago, you know, I forget, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, with the Klamath tribes in Oregon. And then there have been various, I think, settlements with in Arizona and in the Southwest in terms of tribal water rights. But I'm not really aware of very much of that going on in California at all. Am I missing something in terms of the assertion of tribal water rights and the, you know, the granting of them? And if that hasn't really happened, do you think that's going to change in the near future?
Oh, I think it's going to change drastically. You know, one of the things in California that was set up different is that they created rancheria lands rather than having treaty rights and spelling out those treaty rights. They set up homeless Indian land bases and then turned those homeless Indian land bases into tribes without any negotiated rights. But I think that tribes like Hoopaw are going to be pushing on the water rights. You know, they have been very successful as far as, you know, pushing back against wetlands with only a water agreements. But I think that soon they will push for the water rights. But all of California tribes are getting heads up to those rights and the Indigenous people's rights to defend for our watersheds and for our way of life. And so I think that that will change. And there are a lot more attorneys who are into this kind of practice right now. You know, you have federal Indian law attorneys and you have environmental law attorneys, and they're kind of negotiating on how to bring this up. And we're still trying to bring up the 1941 Act into a lawsuit maybe to find out how does Congress continue on appropriating money for a project that they never really paid for. They never really carried out that act. They basically stole Shasta Lake and the lands that are all under it. Yeah.
There's a question here, John, that perhaps you can help. Can someone talk about San Francisco's role in the reduced flows in the Bay Delta? And perhaps you can expand a little bit on that, on all the diversions upstream from the Delta.
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of times we focus on your home, Bettina.
Los Angeles, big bad Los Angeles. And
Yeah.
I always like to point out that it's actually San Francisco that built, you know, a reservoir in a national park. It wasn't Los Angeles. But.
It's true, and until very recently, San Francisco. Well, okay, backing up, San Francisco takes its water out of the Tuolumne River, which flows out of Yosemite, down into the San Joaquin River, into the southern Delta, and then through to the Bay. And until recently, San Francisco and almost all of the water rights holders upstream, folks who have you know, some claim to be able to divert water, they did not have responsibility for what happened downstream of them. They didn't have responsibility for water quality conditions in the Delta. That was left to the federal government and the state government because A, they're easy to deal with, and B, because of their water rights, which were not, you know, that strong. So I remember reading documents in 2016 where San Francisco was, or no, it was earlier than that now, my memory's many years before that, but San Francisco was wanting to take more water out of the Tuolumne, and they acknowledged that this would cause water quality problems in the Delta, exacerbate fisheries problems, endangered species problems. And then they closed that section by saying, but we have no responsibility for what happens in the Delta. This changed recently in 2018 when the State Water Resources Control Board said, you know what, all of the diverters of water upstream and in the Delta are going to need to play a role here. Everybody's going to have to pay what we call their ecological fair share. And there are water rights involved, and that's a whole big mess to sort out, but it can't be just left to the entities that Jacob focused on in his film to solve the problems all by themselves. So on the Tuolumne, there will be water quality standards that San Francisco and the agricultural districts there will have to meet. And on neighboring streams in the San Joaquin Basin, they'll have to meet these new standards as well, which would require a lot more water to flow down from the Sierra to the San Joaquin into the Delta, and eventually we would hope out into the Bay. And San Francisco has resisted this. It's a great irony. They filed suit against the water board, making a variety of claims, and they basically want to say, you know, you can't touch our water. So it's lost in this little bit of a shell game, right? Because they're just diverting the water upstream, and for a long time, like, people didn't notice that they were a part of the problem. And it's a real shame that the bay that shares its name, the bay that shares the name of the city of San Francisco, is suffering from fisheries that can't support the historic fisheries of this region. I mean, San Francisco started at Fisherman's Wharf, right? Like, that's where Jacob interviewed Larry Collins, Fisherman's Wharf, and yet the fleet is declining. And so the shame is that the city of San Francisco is not willing to do what LA has done, and which LA could do more of, and really invest in recycled water and stormwater capture, and cracking down on the folks that San Francisco sells water to make them use less water, get them all to use less water, and really steward this unpredictable resource of water that we have. They don't want to do that. They don't want to come into the future. Their claim is, well, we use less water than other people here in Northern California. And it's like, well, that's because it's Northern California, right? I mean, there's less demand.
In San Francisco,
yeah. I mean,
well, of course, I mean, the reason that Los Angeles has started to, was required to take less water from the Owens Valley and rewater part of the Owens River and reduce its diversions from the Mono Lake tributaries was because they were forced to, as a result of, lawsuits and decisions under the Public Trust Act. And then, you had the State Water Board beginning to basically to push that with all the, the upstream diverters, including San Francisco. And as you noted, the Newsom administration, put a hold on that. There have been a lot of lawsuits. There's been this enormous pushback. And so there doesn't seem to be, the political will to force the upstream diverters to reduce what they're taking out of the tributaries, as there was the political will and and ultimately the legal victory to force Los Angeles to stop taking, so much water out of the Owens Valley. What's the disconnect here?
Well,
Jared, perhaps you can.
Yeah.
Well, if I can speak to political will, which is something in short supply these days in Washington, but Bettina, you ask a great question. What is it going to take? And I think, sometimes you just need more leverage. You need these drivers to force people to get out of their hardened positions. And, right now, there's an enormous sense of entitlement in all of these tributaries. People think that they're senior water rights holders, and California water law has always rewarded the first in time, first in right, and not asked a lot of questions about how the water is being used or what the redirected impacts of that are. That's could change through litigation. Some of these endangered species listings and restrictions that tend to accompany that could be drivers of change. I mentioned a moment ago that I think climate change could be a driver of change because it's going to really disrupt a lot of these systems that we've come to rely on. And the other piece, it's a little harder for some of the tributary water users, but for urban water users, there are just all kinds of other solutions and alternatives to meet their needs. And as we continue to innovate and hopefully create incentives and policies that move them in that direction, that too can be part of the solution.
So I've got some questions here for Jon, Jared, and Caleen. So anybody, what do each of you believe are the 2 or 3 actions Governor Newsom can and should do right now to put California's water policy on a better path? Jacob. Whoops, I'm sorry. That wasn't. Caleen, how about you, Caleen?
For Newsom, we're in the whole situation of the tunnel, the conveyance, New Deal kind of thing, but the same old deal with no other new ways of looking at things. And I think there should be some investigations on how to assist the cities in creating water projects or water capture or water ways to not put a strain on, and also to connect the water export to the depletion of the salmon and the disruption of the river systems. Because we're a drought state, we're also a flyway state, and we have this intensive water discharge, to 80% of it going to agriculture, which is only 2% of the products out of California, or the economy for California. And also that we have to look at and study, the area that's being farmed and the land that's going fallow and the reasons that it is. And maybe we should divert back to studying whether or not we could be a salmon state again. We should be a salmon state. We're one of 4 states in the nation that should have salmon running up these rivers again like they did before. And it's healthy for everybody. We should be shipping salmon around the world to feed people.
Speaking of almonds, there's another question. Can the problem be addressed by the California legislature imposing significant taxes on almond production? Anybody can have a stab on that one?
Yeah, I think, well, my personal thing is that we should not be growing almonds in the desert where there's no water for them. We should do appropriate planting in the state for the areas that they are. I mean, I don't think we should be growing rice in the valley either. That's not appropriate. But for some reason, because there is water and now they're fighting over the water, and the fisheries are crashing. And to me, that means not just a fishery, but a whole system, a water intensive system that provides life to all of California. And that, we need to back up and look at that and say, how far can you take that before it crashes? And when it does, how many millions of people are going to be affected by that?
And then what can average viewers like me do to advocate for serious, effective, science-based solutions? Anybody?
Independent, some independent studies need to be done. I don't trust the government studies anymore, especially when they don't like the results. They just hire some more. They pay them more to come out with the evidence that they need to do their products. I mean, we should have students studying it. They're going to inherit this whole problem.
John?
Yeah, I can pick up on maybe the past few questions. I think that what people need to do, as Jacob said early on, is know where their water comes from, and then let people know, let elected officials know. Simply, you don't have to be an expert in this. You simply have to let people know, I care about my rivers being drinkable, swimmable, fishable. That's what the law requires. I understand that too much water is being taken out of our rivers, causing a host of problems. I want you to do something about it. I think Representative Huffman would agree that, like, a lot of letters like that, pretty powerful. But in terms of what Governor Newsom can do, I mean, I mentioned before what would you be asking him to do? Well, the State Water Resources Control Board has to do its job. It's a legal obligation. It's a Clean Water Act federally and Clean Water Act state obligation that the State Water Resources Control Board has. It's supposed to update these standards, or at least review them, every 3 years. We're in year 12 of a 3-year review. And meanwhile, our species continue to decline. On the other side, again, I said it's not just about like enforcing all the laws we already have, although that's necessary. There's the other side about how do you incentivize progress to get us out of this. The state put together, the governor, to his credit, put together a water resiliency portfolio, gathered all sorts of ideas for how can we make our water supply more resilient, and many of those ideas put forward by environmental NGOs were ways of doing that would reduce harm on the environment. But we said water that's saved through all of these different mechanisms has to go back to the people who are not getting clean water right now, and the environment, which is obviously suffering. You have to link, you can't just do conservation and let the next person down the road take more water. You have to link these together. But you have to serve these two ends with this whole big list of things in the portfolio. And
you talked about the water portfolio. There's a question here about what are your thoughts, question for all, what are your thoughts on desalinization, seawater desalination?
So maybe I'll jump in, Bettina, quickly on the pending questions you posed. What can regular people do to support science-based? I would say defend our bedrock environmental laws. They're not always fast in getting us to the right place, but they are really powerful tools to prevent bad science and junk science from driving bad policy. And the fact is, they've helped us weather the last 4 years of an unprecedented historic attack on science under the Trump administration. So don't take them for granted. When you see them being politicized and attacked, stand up for the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, stand up for the ESA, for NEPA, and other bedrock environmental laws. In terms of what Newsom can do, Governor Newsom, I think changing the paradigm is the thing that some governor is going to have to do to get this state unstuck, your original question. And one of the things that I think Jacob did a really nice job on in this film was pointing out that the business model for one of these behemoth water players, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, is to just suck as much water as possible out of the Delta and the Colorado River and sell it as a wholesaler. It has no incentive to be efficient. It has no incentive to develop local water supplies or to have some of its customers diversify their portfolios and rely less on them. It has every incentive to keep much of the state hooked on those sources of supply. We can find other ways to meet water needs through much of the state. But when you have that much power and influence and your entire business model is based on sucking that water out of those resources and wholesaling it to all of your customers and keeping them hooked on that, that's a problem. And breaking out of that paradigm is something Gavin Newsom could help us do.
I mean, that certainly is, that is what Metropolitan was formed and created, as the water importer. That said, Metropolitan is actually, has been doing a lot in terms of promoting conservation urban conservation, it's now looking quite seriously into a huge water recycling project in Los Angeles. There's an enormous wastewater treatment plant that currently sends all of the treated wastewater out into the Pacific Ocean. And they've got a pilot project going about treating, capturing that water, not sending it out to the ocean, treating it, and then probably using it to replenish the local groundwater basins. So Metropolitan is not solely focused on its traditional role, and I think realizes that it's got to do more than that. That is really not the future.
They've taken some baby steps, offering some incentives for some of their customers to develop projects like desalination, the question that was just asked. They can do a lot more. And the State Water Project, which is the one that actually owns these water rights that get sold to Metropolitan and others, could do a lot more by diversifying the kind of water sources that it itself develops, so that it's not just the Delta and Colorado River.
Okay, I think we've got like 2 minutes left. For Jacob, who was one person you wish you could have interviewed, and what would you have asked them?
Well, for context, I think I interviewed about 70 people for this movie.
Yeah, he interviewed a hell of a lot of people.
Yeah, and most of them, or maybe not most, but almost half of them didn't make it in just because of the way this works. Although it was very useful to me in terms of understanding the topic and figuring out how I was going to tell a story. But Caleen, or Chief Sisk, is someone who's on this panel, but who I didn't have the opportunity to interview. And I think the story of, really just the tribal perspective in Northern California is one that I wasn't able to work into the story, but I wish I was able to, because, they have a very interesting perspective, I think, on the tunnels, a very interesting perspective on what the Trump administration did with water and what the Biden administration can do. That's sort of, I think, for me, a part of the story that, if the movie could be even longer, that I would have covered that for sure.
So I'll have one last question, and we touched on it, but I mean, as was noted in the film and is noted by our speakers here, most water use in California and in the West is by agriculture. It's not by urban users. And certainly I don't think anybody would disagree that knows anything about California water politics, that agriculture, which is actually a very small portion of California's economy, has an outsized influence and power on water in California, which stems from the fact that a lot of the big irrigation districts have these very old appropriative water rights because they got here first. How do you break that political hold that agriculture has on California water?
I think it just goes back to that idea of, and this might be naive, but I think if more average people learned about where their water comes from and learns about water issues, you'll have enough people, hopefully, who can, write to their congressman or just, become engaged and care about water issues and hopefully move us in the right direction. Because I think right now, because it's, in their business interest, they're making money off of the water that they can use to grow crops. Agriculture, is of course going to do everything they can to, keep their supply and maximize their supply. So in my opinion, that's hopefully the use of a film like this, and not like this film is going to solve the problem, but hopefully is a very small, helpful tool to get more people to learn about this and become engaged.
Okay, I think we're wrapping up. So thank you all panelists. It was good to see you all again, and thank you all who've been watching online at home. Take
Great.
care.
Thank you all so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.